So the next one we're going to talk about is the Copper County strike and Italian Hall tragedy. This happened in 1913. This was a coal mine, and the miners were spending 10 to 12 hours a day underground 6 days a week. Now again, they still didn't have the 8-hour workday all these years later, but they had Sundays off, so they were making a little bit of progress. So workers were rarely granted raises. Their jobs weren't secure, which meant that if you didn't act the right way, that you would get fired or thrown out of your housing. They didn't make very much money, and probably one of the most compelling facts about why they went on strike was this particular area had about 11 or 1,200 people that worked there, but they were losing 60 people a year on the job. So if you think about that, 11 or 1,200 people is about the size of our signal department at the NS or at the CSX. And imagine if 1 or 2 people were dying every week at work, because that's what was going on. So they ended up going out on strike in July of 1913. And there was some violence that was involved in this strike, but it really culminated on Christmas Eve. So on Christmas Eve, the striking miners met with their families at this place called the Italian Hall in Calumet, Michigan. So they met there for a Christmas party. The Italian Hall was a 2-story building where you walked into the doors on the first floor and you walked up to the stairs to the second floor. So several hundred miners or a couple hundred miners and their families were having a Christmas party when a strikebreaker came in onto the first floor and they yelled fire. And even though there wasn't a fire, in the pandemonium and the panic that set in, everybody ran down the stairs and tried to get out the door. But if you pay attention to the year that this happened, which was 1913, the doors actually opened to the inside. You see, they didn't have building codes that said that doors had to open to the outside so people could exit and be safe. So in the panic that happened, 73 people died that day. 64 of them were their children. And if you take a look at the photograph that's on here, people have asked me that that's a really strange looking railroad, but it isn't a railroad. It's actually a mass grave for children. You see, there was 2 mass graves for children when this happened. One for Catholics and one for everybody else. And when I look at this photograph, I look at how haunted their parents are, because they just lost their children. Their children died a horrific death by being trampled to death because they weren't strong enough and weren't large enough to be able to get out of the way of people trying to get out for an 8-hour workday in a safe workplace. This is part of our history. This is part of why we're here today. The next one that we're going to talk about is the Ludlow Massacre of 1914. This actually happened in Colorado. About 10,000 miners had been on strike, and they started in September 1913. And what happened, they went out on strike in Colorado. They broke up into different colonies of people. And one of the largest ones they had about 1,200 people, and it was run by a Greek man named Louis Tikas. And this is important because his camp had mostly Greek immigrant workers that were there. Anybody that knows any Greek people know that they celebrate Easter on usually a different week than everybody else does. And why this is important to this story is because what a big holiday that Easter is in the Greek culture. But anyways, they went on strike. They started on September 13th, 1913. And they went on strike for the same reasons that the workers went on strike for in Copper County in Michigan. Well, one of the things that's compelling to me is that they're in Colorado. And they went out on September 13th. They were thrown out of their housing, and they lived in tents. The event didn't happen until April 1914, so they thought it was so important that themselves and their families lived in tents. And I know in Colorado they get an awful lot of snow. So they lived in tents in Colorado all through the wintertime. And at the time, just like it was in Chicago, the mine companies could actually kind of purchase either the police departments, but in this case they purchased the National Guard. And so the National Guard was actually ordered to come in and fire into the camp, which is some of the things that happened. So they actually had gunfights during this whole time. There was a lot of violence that happened. But it all culminated on Greek Easter Sunday. So the point I'm making is that Greek Easter is the biggest holiday of the year for anybody that's Greek. It's kind of like Christmas and Easter and the 4th of July and Thanksgiving all wrapped up into one. The biggest holiday of the year, a huge day. Well, on that day, the National Guard was ordered to set up a machine gun nest overlooking their camp, and they fired into the camp. Pop, 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 pop. It was horrible. A gunfight ensued, when the strikebreakers sent down somebody to negotiate a truce for the day. So Louis Tikas and two of his top lieutenants came out to negotiate a peace treaty for the one day, or a truce, but he was executed along with his two top lieutenants. They shot them dead right there. And then they fired up the machine gun again. So the workers were there, and the gunfight ensued until the workers ran out of ammunition, and they took off and they ran up into the hills. Well, they didn't bring their families with them because these were miners, right? So the miners actually dug trenches underneath their canvas tents so that their families could be safe. As I was talking about before, there was gunfights that were going on regularly. So they retreated up into the hills and they left their families in the trenches. Well, the strikebreakers came down and they doused the tents in kerosene and they lit them on fire. And what you're looking at here was 25 women and children were burned alive on Greek Easter Sunday morning, the biggest holiday of the year. The photo that you're looking at initially had 13 people die. 11 children and one woman were burned to death and suffocated and burned to death on Greek Easter Sunday morning because they wanted a safe workplace in an 8-hour workday. It really compels me because I understand how important Greek Orthodox Easter is, and I can't even imagine having a tragedy like that happen, all for an 8-hour workday at a safe workplace.